I realize this is a little awkward situation this afternoon. We have a party and we have some really hardcore economics going on at the same time. But we try to pack it all into PorcFest and give people choices. And in case it doesn't come across, we're so pleased to have our next speaker, Joe Salerno. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for showing up. It's tough to compete, as Doug said, with Buzz's Big Gay Dance. I may leave in the middle of my lecture, so. But anyway, let me start by pointing out that there's been a relentless war on cash by almost all governments in the world. And it's been becoming not only relentless, but it's becoming more and more exaggerated as time goes on. What are the reasons for the government's attempt to stamp out, to suppress cash transactions between consenting adults? Right, one is right here. One reason, of course, is the same reason that the director of the FBI yesterday, 2 days ago, admitted to Congress that they've been using drones to spy in the U.S. And it's the same reason that the NSA has the PRISM program, which forces Google and other internet providers to turn over all of their information to the NSA, and the reason that they force Verizon every day, to turn over all their phone records. Okay, the same reason. They want to track you. Okay, they don't want you to have any privacy, and financial privacy of all the types of privacy from government snooping is probably what's most important to all of us as individuals. Because you can really tell the story of an individual's life and know where he's gone, what he's doing, what his deepest preferences are, what his sexual proclivities are, by tracking financial records. And so they want these people in government who hate transparency like a vampire hates sunlight. They want everything about us to be transparent. Just as they look through your clothes when you try to board a plane, they want to make all your affairs that transparent. They want you naked. They want all of you, well, they believe all of you are suspected or potential drug lords, arms smugglers, terrorists, money launderers, white-collar criminals. That's what you all are. I don't know why I'm here. I'm afraid to be talking to you. I feel I might be on an FBI watch list all of a sudden, or worse, on Obama's kill list. So we're all under suspicion. With this new war on terror, we're all under suspicion. They don't want you to have any place to hide. And that's why within the next 10 years we'll have 30,000 drones over the skies in the US. This is all part of that program. Now, what's the other reason? The other reason is because the other reason that they want you to use bank cards and electronic transfers through banks rather than cash is because cash is the one thing that when you withdraw it from a bank will bring down their rotten, unstable, inherently unstable fractional reserve banking system. Because by its very nature, fractional reserve banks can't deliver on what they promise. That is, if there's $100,000 of checking accounts in a bank, the banks have to hold, according to current U.S. law, 10% reserves or $10,000. So if people want to withdraw $20,000 on one day, the bank disappears. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about fractional reserve banking and why it's unstable, and then I'll talk about the measures that have been taken by many governments throughout the world, from Sweden to Russia, and to the U.S. of course, to stamp out, suppress, extinguish the use of cash. And it's gone quite far, as we'll see in Scandinavian countries. So let me just talk a little bit about a fractional reserve bank, okay? Fractional reserve bank can only remain in business for as long as public confidence exists that its deposits are really claims to cash. If for any reason the slightest suspicion arises among its clientele that a bank's deposits are no longer payable on demand, the bank's reputation as an issuer of money substitutes, that is, deposit substitutes for cash, disappears. Okay. It vanishes overnight. The brand name of the bank, the reputation of any business, by the way, is contained in its brand name. And I'll talk about this in a few minutes in more detail. But the brand name of a bank will disappear literally overnight. Thus, it's really the threat of insolvency, that is, of not being able to pay its debts, all of a sudden, that hangs over every bank. Okay? And without government deposit insurance, and without the too big to fail doctrine, the willingness of the Federal Reserve to bail out not only banks anymore, but investment banks, huge investment banks like Goldman Sachs, and even GM, that willingness then gives a false confidence that the banks are stable. But as we've seen with Cyprus, even with the European Central Bank guaranteeing deposits in Cyprus, people still don't believe that banks are completely solvent. That is, at a moment's notice, their confidence can dissipate into thin air. Okay, and that's what happened in Cyprus. So in order to get its people to accept its deposits as cash, banks need what von Mises, the great Austrian economist, called a special kind of goodwill, okay? It takes a long time for people to trust a bank, okay, with their money. You know, with thousands and thousands of your hard-earned dollars somewhere else, not under your supervision. It takes a while for banks to build up this sort of a confidence or trustworthiness, okay? And it's only this trustworthiness that makes all of us, this feeling of confidence, refrain from at every moment taking our money out. As soon as that confidence is lost, okay, it's a subjective state of mind. There doesn't have to be a real problem with the bank. People just have to suspect that there's a problem. Too loud? Good, okay. But this kind of confidence is different than the usual customer goodwill that's essential to any business. Once this confidence disappears among a few people, okay, everyone else loses confidence because they see people rushing to the bank, and even if they themselves don't have a suspicion initially, they wonder why are they rushing to the banks, and they rush to the banks. That doesn't happen if a few people, for example, don't like Walmart or lose confidence in Walmart products. They leave. Okay, Walmart loses some money, but other people don't rush, don't withdraw their customer goodwill from Walmart and suddenly go to Target. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit more about this type of a situation. So in other words, a fractional reserve bank is bankrupt the minute that people think that it's bankrupt, okay? That's not true in any other business. And now let me give you an example, which I think is a very good example. And some of you may remember. Actually, before I do that, let me just read you a quote first from von Mises, and then from Murray Rothbard. Here's von Mises. He says, the confidence which a bank and the money substitutes has issued in joy is indivisible. Now, by money substitutes, he means the deposits, the checking deposits, and in the old days, the notes that banks were able to issue. They're not able to issue them anymore. It is either present with all clients or it vanishes entirely. If some of the clients lose confidence, the rest of them lose it too. One must not forget that every bank issuing unbacked deposits is in a rather precarious position. Its most valuable asset is its reputation. It must go bankrupt as soon as doubts arise concerning its perfect trustworthiness and solvency. Now, what does Murray Rothbard say? He says, but in what sense is a bank sound? Sound meaning stable. When one whisper of doom, one faltering of public confidence should quickly bring the bank down. In what other industry, and I'm continuing to quote Rothbard, does a mere rumor or hint of doubt bring down a mighty and seemingly solid firm? What is it about banking that public confidence should play such a decisive and overwhelmingly important role? The answer lies in the nature of our banking system, in the fact that both commercial banks and thrift banks, meaning savings banks, have been systematically engaged in fractional reserve banking. That is, they have far less cash on hand, very simple, than there are demand claims, checking accounts, to the cash outstanding. Now, here's where I want to give you an example. There was a huge bank in the US. Its name was Washington Mutual Bank. And it collapsed in September of 2008. It was the largest bank failure in United States history. WAMU, as it was called, Washington's Mutual, WAMU, had been in existence for 119 years, so it had a lot of goodwill, and was the sixth largest bank in the US, with assets of $307 billion. That is, it had used customers' deposits to purchase assets that returned interest to it of $307 billion. It had branches throughout the country and billed itself as the Walmart of banking. It was one of the top performers on Wall Street until shortly before its failure. So even Wall Street didn't see it coming, okay? It was a very high earner. Its depositors clearly had confidence in its solidity, especially given that its deposits were insured by the federal government, reinforced by the existence of the Fed's too big to fail policy. Sixth largest bank in the country. How could the Fed ever let that fail? And yet, almost overnight, that special goodwill that we talked about, that gave its deposits the quality of money, that people were willing to accept a check from it, because it was just like accepting money, okay, that disappeared overnight, okay, as panic-stricken depositors rushed to get their money out. And of course, the bank doesn't have all the money that it promises depositors in its possession. This event was triggered by something else entirely. That is, Lehman Brothers, the brokerage house in New York City, failed. So people got scared. A week after Lehman Brothers failed, mighty WAMU was no more. It disappeared in a week. What other company can that happen to outside of the banking industry? None. Okay? Now I'm going to give you a very extreme example of what happens to customer goodwill when people die from a company's products. It's not even as bad as what happened to WAMU, for example. Oh, by the way, let me just mention also, this is why, before I get to the example, after WAMU collapsed, they began to pour money into the banking system. They were fearful that the entire system would collapse, and they were right to be fearful of that. Had the Fed and the Treasury not acted aggressively right after that, you would have had the entire US banking system coming down and bringing foreign banks down too. So in one single day in December of 2008, the combined emergency lending by the Fed and the US Treasury had risen to a peak of $1.2 trillion. That's the money they loaned to banks here and in foreign countries. And let me just give you some of the names. Citibank, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, European banks like the Royal Bank of Scotland and the Swiss bank, UBS, okay? Without this unprecedented bailout, had they not bailed these banks out, those banks, which had had these sterling reputations for over 100 years, many of them, would have disappeared into thin air. That would have been it, okay? Again, can the failure of one firm in an industry bring down a whole industry anywhere else? If people start dying because General Motors makes crappy cars, does that mean that Chrysler's product, the Chrysler, Toyota, and so on go out of business? Of course not. They get more business. But that doesn't happen in the banking industry. And we have to ask ourselves why that doesn't happen. So let me give you the other example I promised. This was the example of the Tylenol murders that occurred in Chicago in 1982. You may remember them. In this incident, 7 people had died from ingesting capsules of the analgesic super-strength Tylenol, the painkiller, that had been laced with potassium cyanide. However, not only was the parent company, which was Johnson & Johnson, able to maintain its business goodwill by its successful response to the tragedy, it immediately pulled everything off the shelves. It had investigators look and find that, in fact, it had nothing to do with their production process. It had to do with someone who was deliberately trying to murder people. And guess what? The Tylenol brand name didn't disappear like the WAMU brand name. It's still with us, okay? Now, it's true that many customers stopped purchasing Tylenol for a while, you know, as I did, for example. And that its share of the painkiller market dropped from 37% to 8%. But by the following year, its brand name was thriving. It had, again, 30% of the market. Furthermore, Johnson & Johnson stock, which went down initially, okay, WAMU stock went down to 0 in a few days. Just went to 0, okay? Never came back. But that's not true of Johnson & Johnson stock. In fact, the stock actually increased later on after it handled its response. Not only that, it didn't bring down the whole painkiller market. People didn't stop buying painkillers, but yet it would have brought down the whole banking system if we didn't have that bailout in 2008. And of course, there was never any question that its competitors would be brought down, okay? So there is something different about banking. And might mention that banking is, as I said, inherently inflationary. Let me give you a few words on that. When a bank lends out its depositors' deposits, it only keeps a fraction in reserve, as we mentioned. Let's say 10% in the U.S. Okay, so if you put $100,000 into a bank, that means that you've traded $100,000 in currency for $100,000 in checking accounts. The currency initially is in the vault of the bank. So there's no change in the money supply. There's still $100,000. You haven't added any money to the economy. That's 100% reserve banking. However, in today's economy, under fractional reserve banking, the bank will then lend out $90,000. So now you have $100,000 in your checking account, but someone else has $90,000 of currency. Now, they don't actually lend in currency, but to make it simple, we'll assume they do. So now there's $190,000 in the banking system, okay? But there's only $100,000 of reserves, backing up the $190,000. But then, when that $90,000 is lent out, the person who borrows it spends it. Let's say to open a small business. And the person who, the workers he pays, let's say, to build the business, will then put that $90,000 in their banks. Those banks only have to hold 10%. So they only hold $9,000, and they lend out $81,000. Okay, so you get the idea. Now there's $271,000 in the economy just because you put $100,000. So let me make this more real for you. Right before Christmas, people want to walk around with a lot more cash in their pockets. So they withdraw billions of dollars throughout the United States from the banking system. The banking system would be in real trouble if the Fed did not, during that period, print up reserves. Simply print them up out of thin air, okay? All a reserve is an entry in a computer at the Federal Reserve Bank. It's not even paper dollars. Now, they can print the paper dollars to pay the bank off when a bank wants those reserves. So in cyberspace, it simply enters, billions of dollars. It said now there's billions more dollars, and we've paid this to the banks in exchange for their bonds. So the banks now have billions more they can pay out to you and me during the Christmas season, so that there's not a collapse of the money supply. The money supply would collapse, it would go way down. Because as I said, there's much more checking deposit money than there are reserves. So that's why it's inherently insolvent or bankrupt banks. Or at least as soon as people try to get their money out, they find out that it is. All right, let me just talk now about the actual war on cash, what's happened, and how it's progressed. Okay, in 1970, in the U.S., we had the Bank Secrecy Act passed. Of course, so whenever government uses a word, it always means the opposite, right? It's not the Bank Secrecy Act. It's the Government Snooping Act, okay? And that's been tweaked ever since, especially with the Patriot Act. It's been changed. It's made bank privacy even less, okay? It's reduced bank privacy. Basically what it did was it was supposed to allow governments, to assist governments in cracking down on money launderers, okay? Which is a weasel word. What does money laundering mean? Okay, it can mean almost anything, right? Specifically, the act requires a financial institution to keep records of cash purchases of any negotiable instrument. And that's any kind of a bond or stock or anything. Commercial paper, okay? That goes through the banking system. Okay. As long as it's more than if it's more than $10,000. So the bank has to report any sort of deposit, basically, for more than $10,000. Has to do all this paperwork and report it. And even any transaction for more than $10,000. I had a friend whose wife was buying an automobile, and she took money from a money market fund. I think she took out $17,000, something like that. It was more than $10,000. And she didn't fill out the proper forms, and she deposited it in the bank that she wanted to draw a check on to pay for the car, and they refused to release the money. What they did was they kept the money to pay for, and would only use it to pay federal income taxes. So that's one of the provisions of the Bank Secrecy Act. If you don't fill out the right forms, okay, you're automatically a money launderer. Okay, they're going to keep your money, right? So you have to prove that you're not the money launderer by filling out all this blizzard of paperwork that the government imposes on the banks and on you. Okay. All right. So there's another way that the U.S. government has fought against you using cash. Up until the 1940s, there were denominations of those Federal Reserve notes. You could get a $500 bill. There was a $1,000 bill. There was a $5,000 bill. There was even a $10,000 bill. So people could make huge purchases without notifying the government. I mean, $10,000 in 1940 is worth in purchasing power way over $100,000 today. Okay. But the U.S. started printing these large denomination notes in 1945, and then they took them out of circulation by 1969, okay? So they were all gone. But so if you take 1969 as the year that the last big denomination note was taken out of circulation, you can see that this is $20. In 1969, what it took you $20, actually less, $16.67 to buy, now takes you 5 of these to buy. The government has inflated away over 80% of the purchasing power. So what is a $20 bill today? What does a $100 bill equal today? It equals less than $20 in 1969. So not only have they removed the big denomination bills, but they've inflated away the purchasing power of the $100 bill, which is the biggest denomination bill that we have. So you can only make very, very small purchases with cash, or you have to carry a lot of different bills around, okay? So that was another instance of its war against cash. And it forced American consumers to use more and more bank cards and debit cards, credit cards, and so on. All right. Except around here, I noticed that if I went to a few of the restaurants around here, they insist on cash. There's at least 3 that insist on cash, which I think is wonderful. Okay, and for a number of reasons. One, obviously for the privacy reason. Okay, and number 2, of course, the more cash we use, the more we pull out of the banks, the more shaky the banks get. And ultimately, you want to destroy the banking system as it is today is not a free market institution. It's just an arm of government. So it'd be great. I mean, one way to strike at the state would be for everyone really to take all their cash out of the bank. In fact, when I was a student at Boston College, and I won't say when, but it was sometime in the 70s, and there was an underground newspaper, and I think it was called The Phoenix, and it would inform all students in Boston, and there's over 200,000 students, college students in Boston at the various universities there. All students in Boston, there was a campaign by a number of Marxist economists at Harvard and a few other universities that wanted to stop the Vietnam War, and they thought that the way they could do that would be to destroy the banking system. So they put out a full-page ad that all the students, who all had checking accounts, all students on Friday of the following week should go and pull all of their cash out of all the Boston banks. Okay, now that would have worked. I mean, everybody said, yeah, that's great. We can stop the war. But, you know, that's 7 days away. Students have high time preferences. We party and stuff. So everybody forgot about it by that following Friday. So it never happened. But theoretically, it would have brought down the banking system. Okay, or let's put it this way. It would have vastly inconvenienced the banks in Boston because they don't have that cash on hand. And it takes a while for the Fed to print that cash up. So what they would have done was put holds on people's checking accounts. You know, even the citizens of Boston, it would have been very difficult for them to get more than $100, $200 out at a time. Okay, so it would have maybe gummed the works up for a couple of months while they shipped all this cash in armored cars. So today that would work. If there were a mass movement, and you're not allowed to advocate this, so I'm not advocating it. It's against the law. No, it is against the law to bring the hint of suspicion that a bank is unstable. So specifically to say, you know, that this bank is going to collapse, get your money. So I'm not saying that. I'm saying if you did do that, then that would bring down the banking system. So it's a complete subjunctive. Okay, it's not an imperative. I'm not telling you to do it. Okay, let's talk about Sweden, because Sweden has gone the furthest in trying to crush and stamp out cash. In Swedish cities, let me give some examples. Tickets for public buses no longer accept cash. Tickets must be purchased in advance via a cell phone text message. Okay. Many small businesses refuse cash, and many bank facilities have completely stopped handling cash. They won't pay out cash, and they won't accept cash. Even churches in Sweden have put in electronic card readers for contributions. Okay. And so in Sweden, cash transactions are only about 3% of the Swedish economy, while they're 9% in Europe and about 7% in the US. Interestingly, the leader of the anti-cash movement in Sweden is Bjorn Ulvaeus. Anyone know who he is? That's Benny of the pop group ABBA. Okay, so he's against cash because his son got robbed 3 times. Probably an idiot son that's out, you know, late at night, walking around flashing a lot of his daddy's cash. So he's robbed 3 times. So there's a solution: get rid of cash so the kid won't be robbed. Okay, so he's ahead of that. And then there was an expert on so-called expert on underground economies. He says if people use more cards, they are less involved in shadowy economics activities, and they're less likely to get robbed. Well, thanks for that, right? I mean, that's so you need the government to protect you from doing stupid things like flashing $100 bills late at night in a bad area or in a nightclub or something. Oscar Swartz, who's the founder of Sweden's first internet provider, supports the phasing out of cash. Of course he does. He wants more electronic transactions. That makes more money for him. It's not just the government, it's a lot of these big banks that want more to stamp out cash. He argues that without the adoption of anonymous payment methods, people who send money and make donations to various organizations, with the adoption, or without anonymous payments like cash, people who send money and make donations to various organizations can be, in his words, traced every time. So he wants everybody to be able to be traced. I mean, this is a Swedish entrepreneur. Okay, but that's the whole point of the cashless economy. So as I said before, so that we could all be traced, okay? So that our most intimate activities can be reconstructed by FBI profilers or whatever, whoever the hell they are. Now, of course, major Swedish banks all support this. There's 4 huge Swedish banks. 3 of them have begun to phase out cash at their branches. Let me just give you an example. Of these 3, there's 780 branch offices. 530 will no longer accept a cash payment or pay out cash to you. They'll tell you to go down the street and use an ATM, okay? Which is also electronic, right? So you can get cash, but you can't get it from a teller. You have to go to an electronic device to get it. They continue to phase out the manual handling of cash at a rapid pace. During the period from 2010-2012, cash disappeared from 465 Swedish bank branches. So one spokesman for the biggest bank, Swedbank, or the second biggest bank, says that his bank is working actively to reduce the amount of cash in society. The reasons for this, of course, have nothing to do with pumping up earnings from the bank's the fees they charge on their cards. He doesn't say that that's the reason, or to stop people. If you're not using cash, then it's less likely that you're going to run to the bank and pull your cash out and cause the banks to collapse. No, that's not the reason he gives. The reason he gives, he says, the reasons are the environment, cost, and security. He says, we ourselves emit 700 tons of carbon dioxide by cash transport. It costs society $11 billion per year, and cash helps robberies everywhere. So don't use cash. You're stupid if you use cash. Cash causes robberies. Cash causes pollution of the environment. Cash causes $11 billion us to spend that much money to clean up the environment. All this lying nonsense. But here's a good part of the story. The Swedish public has resisted this trend towards a cashless economy. Last year, the value of cash transactions in Sweden were 99 billion krona, 99 billion kronas, which was about the same as 10 years before. Now, the economy has grown, but the Swedes want their cash. Also, there was a study of bank customer satisfaction, and in those banks where cash is not being handled, the customer satisfaction rating has gone down. But the biggest bank in Sweden is heroic. It's called Handelsbanken, and it's, as I said, the largest one. And the head of one of the officers of the bank says, as long as we know that our customers are asking for cash, it is important that we as a bank are providing it. We see places where other banks are making other decisions. We get customers from them and positive response. So they're stealing customers from the other 3 banks who don't want to use cash. Who won't allow their customers to deposit in cash. Let me give you an example of Norway, which is pretty grim too. And the anti-cash mania in Norway has progressed to the point where even government institutions will not accept cash in payment for services rendered. That's a violation of Norway's own legal tender laws. That is that every note is full legal tender for public debts, all debts, public and private. So a friend from Norway wrote me a letter, an email, and he said, about a month ago, here's an interesting story. About a month ago, I had a doctor's appointment at the city's health service emergency ward, which is a government institution. When leaving, I asked to pay cash. I was told that the cashier's desk was closed, that I would be invoiced, and that they generally did not accept cash. I reminded the nurse on duty about legal tender. When I got the invoice, I called the accountant at the ward. I told the accountant that I wished to pay cash. I was told that was not possible, to pay your debt in cash. I asked if she knew about legal tender, referring to the specific legislation. She went completely defensive, as I clearly perceived it. She even claimed that legal issues with no cash arrangement had been dealt with. She was just lying to him. I said I would file a complaint, so I did. I called in a few days later to check if the complaint had been received, which she could confirm. Now the accountant was apparently more interested in discussing the issue. Yesterday I got the written response. I was given the opportunity to pay cash in this one case, only in this case, if I brought the exact amount, okay, so exact amount, she's not going to give him any change. Moreover, no changes in the general arrangements would be made. This is a one-time thing only. Today I made the payment in cash. Why did they do this? I would suspect that they figured they had a weak legal case, that they were dealing with someone who apparently wasn't going to give up, with, and that allowing it in this case would avoid having to deal with someone with a formal legal interest in challenging their anti-cash system. The alternatives being changing their system voluntarily and fighting a court case, or even worse, a complaint, or even worse, a court case. But of course, it's better if we weren't forced to use government fiat money, if we could use gold and silver and so on. But given that we can use government fiat money, that we have to use it, the government itself should accept it, for crying out loud, and not force us to use these bank cards. Well, let me give you a few other examples, and then I'll take questions. In France, just at the end of last year, they imposed a huge tax increase right in the middle of a recession, a 32 billion euro tax increase. The French Prime Minister, named Ayrault, refused to slash the budget, despite the fact that the French budget is just larded, filled with fascistic and corporate welfare payments, okay? That is, that France just subsidizes its corporations. So instead of trying to cut the budget, of course, he wants to squeeze more taxes out of the French citizens. So what he boasted, he said, look, I'm calling this National Anti-Fraud Committee and to crack down on tax cheats. And he boasted that I'm presiding over it myself, the first head of state to preside over an anti-fraud committee. What else? Doesn't he have anything else that he can do or did that he's proud of besides presiding over this crappy little committee? But what came out of the whole thing was that, but by the way, tax fraud in France is between 60 and 80 billion euros, okay, which is quite high. So they wanted to crack down on the cheats. And so basically what they did was, they wanted to lower the maximum payment that you could make in cash from 3,000 to, there was already a limit of 3,000 euros, to 1,000 euros. Under the new limit of 1,000 euros, a French citizen would not even be able to buy a used car for cash, okay? That is, at any given transaction, you can't spend in cash, you can't pay in cash more than 1,000 euros. So we don't have that in the United States yet, an absolute limit, but in effect you do. I mean, it's really $10,000 in some sense. Because you really have to, if you take more than $10,000 out of a bank, then you got to fill out all these forms and all those background checks go on and so on. And this new law is called, this is true only for French citizens. There are foreigners that live in France, or there are citizens of France that live almost full-time in foreign countries. They're subjected to a limit of 10 to 15,000 euros. The reason why is because it's called the Depardieu exception. Gerard Depardieu is a French actor, and he moved to Russia because they have a 13% tax rate. Okay, so they didn't want to lose any more of the millionaires, which they're losing like crazy. So they gave the millionaires an exception. Let me just last talk about Italy. The Italians love their cash, okay? I remember all my grandparents came from Italy, and I remember that they always had cash around the house. They didn't trust banks. They didn't trust banks because the whole Italian economy was corrupt from where they came, and then they lived through the Depression in the United States when banks collapsed. But that's still part of the mentality of Italian citizens. But Italy last year lowered the maximum on cash transactions from 2,500 euros to 1,000 euros. Once again, you can't buy a car, you can't buy big appliances and so on with cash. The Italian government was trying to lower it more to 500 euros or even 300 euros. Right? But that, they figure they'll phase that in. The reason for the limit on the size of cash transactions is the fact that the rotten and corrupt Italian government is trying to reduce a $1.9 trillion euro debt. Okay? So it's huge. It's probably bigger than the US in proportion to its total income for the economy. All right? So it was a way of cracking down on tax evasion, that is, tracking people through bank cards. And so they gave some figures here. They said that the Italians very infrequently use credit cards. Over 7.5 million Italians, and there's probably 40 or 50 million Italians, don't even have checking accounts. So this would really be a burden on on people with the poor people without checking accounts. But of course, the Italian banks are in favor of it. They get money, 2% on their credit card transactions. And interestingly, the former corrupt prime minister, who's pretty funny actually, and pretty insightful, his name is Berlusconi. He had free market leanings, but he just was so corrupt, he finally got thrown out. They got tired of him. But I thought he was kind of lovable, though. I mean, he would say interesting things. Like this, he said, once he saw this bill, he said, there's a real danger of crossing over into a fiscal police state, okay? And I guess last, we'll just mention Russia, which just very recently, a few months ago, wants to ban cash purchases for more than 300,000 rubles. That's not actually a lot. That's about $10,000, starting in 2015. So they want to increase the fraction. They say it outright. We want to increase fractional reserve banks' reserves. So unlike the U.S., they're upfront about it. That's what we want to do. Okay, and if you don't like it, you know, Putin will send somebody to your house and convince you. So the market for money laundering and cash conversions is estimated to be between 3.5 and 7 trillion rubles, about 60% of the Russian federal budget. That is, 60% of the budget is hidden from taxes. And then if you add in criminal activity, this is just activity where people pay under the table, but real criminal activity, it takes you to about 65%. More than half of the Russian economy is underground, either in the black market, which is criminal, or the gray market, which is just hiding things from taxes. So, which is the reason why, because this part of the economy is not taxed, is the reason why Russia is doing as well as it's doing, and it's not doing that well, okay? So I'll stop here. I mean, there are other things we could say, but and I'll take questions on this topic or any others.
I've recently butted heads with what they call Greenbackers, who one of their mantra is that money can't be a commodity, because if it's a commodity, then it'll be corrupted by the ruling class. And myself, with an Austrian background, I understand it's just a means of exchange, and logically it is a commodity. I was just curious, what would be your personal rebuttal to a Greenbacker who says that money can't be a commodity, it needs to be issued by a government of the people?
Okay, this gentleman has asked a question about the Greenbackers, who, like us, dislike the Federal Reserve and want it abolished, and they believe it's a tool of the banks, as we do. But unfortunately, they believe the Federal Reserve is a private institution, when it's really not, okay? Even though it's independent, it really is not, because it was put into place by an act of Congress, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. That can be easily changed tomorrow. And we know that the administration, Republican or Democrat in power, will always put pressure on the Fed to give it a monetary policy that it prefers, which is usually inflation. So given that, what the Greenbackers think, that they think this is a private institution, we'll get rid of the Fed, but we don't want gold, we don't want silver. What we want are true government notes that the government treasury actually issues, okay? that doesn't say Federal Reserve note on it, like our notes do today, which I think is private somehow, that says, you know, the Treasury. Okay. Now, that's actually, we want gold and silver, or we want any kind of commodity that the market chooses. But I favor their plan up to the point, I mean, I wouldn't mind getting rid of the Fed, because everyone thinks the Fed is, you know, if we have to have paper money, I'd rather have the government treasury issuing it. Because right when we see that the government treasury is issuing it, we know that they're doing it because they want to pay corporate welfare, they want to pay for big military wars and interventions. They're using this money to pay for regular welfare and so on. Okay, so people will readily understand that the money is political. Paper money is political once it's fully controlled by the Treasury. Right now, it looks as if it's controlled by experts, these expert economists that run the Fed, and that they're independent, and that they're controlling the money supply according to scientific guidelines, which is nonsense. It's total balderdash. Okay, it's better if you were to force the Fed to simply print up money for the Treasury. We're going to get the same kind of inflation in any case. We have bad inflation with the Fed, you get bad inflation with the Treasury. The only thing is, the Treasury at least is overseen by Congress, which the Greenbackers would agree with, and at least there's a chance that people like Ron Paul and other congressmen would be able to audit it. If it was a creature of Congress, it was overseen by the Treasury, then it would be transparent. So we at least know that it was really political and that it was increasing the money supply for political reasons. But the Greenbackers are wrong about somehow the ruling class is corrupting gold. Gold cannot be corrupted. Yes?
All right, so based on your presentation, I understand that if I were to get together with, say, 1,000 friends and say, hey, we're all going to go deposit our money into this bank, and then 1 month from today, we're all going to withdraw it. You know, give it time for the bank to kind of lend the money out, and then we're going to withdraw it. That would be illegal for us to hatch that plan, and I've never heard this before. Do you have a citation in the U.S. code for that, by chance?
This gentleman asks, what if we came all together in this room, we hatched a scheme to put money in a bank, and then 1 month to the day later, withdraw the money, okay? Forcing the bank into bankruptcy. He's asking me if that's illegal. I'm not sure if that's illegal. Well, there's, if you look in Rothbard's book, America's Great Depression, he points out, or he makes reference to a law that says anyone who casts suspicion on the stability of a bank is acting in violation of a certain law, okay? So you can't pass rumor, even passing rumors about the instability of a bank will bring you legal action against you. And I don't know how much that it's actually enforced. But I think if someone came out and started saying that bank is unstable, you go rush and get your money out. And I'm not saying that about any bank. Right? Just in case there's an FBI drone out there somewhere. I'm not saying that. So I would, so that's, outside of doing that, I don't think you would actually be prosecuted. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, François Neredo from Bastia.org. I have one remark and one question. My remark is that when government people say, oh, we're going to reduce instability or reduce externalities or reduce any kind of problem, what really have happened is that they are concentrating the problems. And
I think he cut you off.
No, I cut myself off, sorry.
Why'd you put it back
So what is actually happening is that government is actually concentrating the instability. So yes, you're not going to get robbed by the mugger on the street, but you're going to get robbed big time by the government instead. So you have traded one kind of distributed and instability that you can control personally through personal responsibility by one different kind of instability that is concentrated and on which you have no power of control. So
I don't think I got the gist of that question. Can you say it?
That was more of a remark than a question. It was more of a reply to one of the arguments the statist gave in favor of no cash. He said He said the advantage of no cash is that you don't get robbed.
Right.
But the thing is, you don't get a lot of small muggings, but instead you have a big robbery, which is a robbery by government.
Right, no, I agree with that, absolutely. It's ridiculous to blame cash for robberies. I mean, that's absurd. You can blame any valuable object for robberies. Should we get rid of expensive cars because they cause robberies? I mean, you know, that's the reductio ad absurdum, thinking it through logically to its absurd result. Shows that it's a ridiculous argument.
And the question itself is that, well, so this is inevitable. We have no control on the process. They will phase out cash. But by phasing out cash, of course, they are phasing out a lot of the value of their own currency. So as their currency becomes less useful to people, people will move to something else. And what will that something else be? Will it be Bitcoin or something else? Or what do you think will happen?
Okay, that's a good point. This gentleman says that by phasing out cash, you make the use of that particular money, the U.S. dollar, less useful. Okay, so and people would tend to use the dollar less and so on. What I think would happen in that case, though, is that people would begin to find alternative types of commodities to use for cash. It would give it would stimulate that sort of behavior.
So this is partially a comment and then partially a question along the lines of what he just said.
Yes.
So it's not necessarily the U.S. dollar as cash that we like. It's the feature of privacy and ease of transferability in person and divisibility and all of that. So, you know, one emerging technology which is enabling that same kind of thing to happen, it would be the untraceable Chaumian digital cash that's been implemented in the open transaction software that exists. Bitcoin has some interesting properties that are like cash, even though it is somewhat traceable. Are you aware of any alternatives, or have you been looking at these problems? What can these people do to not only escape their own government's inflationary, politically controlled currency, but also to just retain that financial privacy and ease of transfer and all of the features that they like about cash?
A very good question. What can we do in the face of this war on cash, which is really a war against privacy? I would take von Mises' position on this. Von Mises once said that there's no way to escape disaster. If the economy's headed toward disaster, all of us are going to feel it in some way or another. So the only thing you can do is to fight back and fight back through education. That is to fight back. Look, Bitcoin is fine. It's a valuable thing. It can be used. It's a great payment system, an anonymous payment system. We don't know how much longer that will last because of the government now starting to take aim at Bitcoin transactions and at Bitcoin exchanges. But that's only a temporary expedient. We have to take our dollar back. We have to be able to use gold and silver again, or whatever commodity the market chooses. Okay? I don't think, unlike some people, I don't think that we can trust the government to go back to the gold standard. They'll only go back part way. There's now a talk in Washington about going back to a gold standard that was hatched about 20 miles from here at Bretton Woods, which is a phony gold standard, which meant the dollar was backed by gold, but only foreign central banks could turn their dollars in for gold. From 1946 to 1971, under that system, which was supposedly a gold standard, you or I, or our parents, grandparents, we couldn't turn the dollars in for gold. There were no gold coins in circulation. It was a phony pseudo-gold standard, and that's a type that is being talked about now. If we go back to that, it will collapse again, just like it did back then, because it didn't put any constraint on the government printing paper money on top of that gold. And that would then discredit the gold standard, would discredit market money forever. I think the best way to proceed at this point is to take all taxes, excise taxes, capital gains taxes, sales taxes, off of gold and silver and off of foreign currencies, and allow people to choose any currency they wish to use. That is, allow American banks to offer deposits in euros and yen and Swiss francs, allow us to transact in these alternative currencies, and allow banks like that bank that was driven that was von Nothaus, I think. I forget the name of the bank
The
itself.
Liberty Dollar.
What was it called?
Yeah, von Nothaus, Liberty Dollar.
Yeah, the Liberty Dollar, which had gold, fully backed his notes with gold, or actually printed, with dollars on the gold. So allow all of those alternative arrangements. I think they would all grow up, and then eventually people would be able to choose a money. And it would stop the government from inflating dollars because people would quickly shift to these other non-inflationary currencies, especially the Swiss franc, for example, at this point.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I remember there was an article, I forget where it was some state, I forget which one, that like someone invented like those little thingamajigs that you plug into your phone that can swipe a credit card, and like that state brought like banking regulations against them and said like, it was like some little Joe Schmo who ran, his corner,
Right.
kiosk. And I wonder if you think, is there any like corporatism of larger businesses that can, have like a credit card reader, maybe using the war on cash, so to speak, against like smaller corner people who, can't have like a credit card reader and just want to like plug a thingamajig into their phone and.
So you're saying that you forcing only or allowing only a certain technology, which would not allow people to carry around their own readers and so on, is you said there were regulations brought against that
Right.
in one state.
Like,
Probably according to them with anti-fraud regulations. Actually, again, they just didn't want people privately engaging in these transactions. I don't know of anything else like that. I do know though that. Walmart wanted to open its own banks, and that was about 3 or 4 years ago. And Bernanke said the Fed would never approve that, and then they smashed Walmart banking. That's the big banks, because Walmart would have, they wanted to be. I forget what their slogan is now, but they wanted to be the little people's banks and so on. So they don't want any kind of competition. There are no other questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.